The largest hammerhead shark ever caught on rod and reel came out of Boca Grande Pass, Florida. It weighed 1,280 pounds and measured 14.5 feet long, and according to fishermen who knew these waters, it was not the big one. For decades, captains around Boca Grande told of another hammerhead moving through the pass. Its head was said to span roughly the width of a pickup truck hood. Its body carried scars from encounters with boats, harpoons, and blades, and its dorsal fin bore a distinctive notch that made returning sightings difficult to dismiss. They called it Old Hitler. Stories described it swallowing tarpon weighing around 200 pounds, striking fishing boats, stealing hooked fish, and surviving repeated attempts to kill it. It was harpooned, it was struck with blades. Boat motors were reportedly driven toward it at full throttle, and it kept returning. That is where the legend becomes harder to separate from the biology. Great hammerheads are capable of learning productive hunting grounds, and researchers have documented individual hammerheads returning repeatedly to the same locations. But Boca Grande's stories stretch across generations, raising a deeper mystery about how much of Old Hitler belonged to one extraordinary shark, and how much belonged to something larger happening beneath the pass. There is another contradiction. The great hammerhead is now classified as critically endangered. One of the ocean's most formidable predators is disappearing even as stories of encounters continue along the waters where animals like it became legendary. In this story, we're going beneath that legend to separate what fishermen witnessed from what modern science can actually explain, and to understand how a predator this powerful could survive so much and still remain almost impossible to catch. If this kind of deep ocean story helps you settle in, hit like and subscribe. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Let's dive in. At Boca Grande Pass, the seafloor changes faster than the shoreline suggests. Between Gasparilla Island and the open Gulf of Mexico, a narrow channel carries the waters of Charlotte Harbor toward deeper water. Within only yards of shore, submerged ledges descend to roughly 75 feet. That abrupt relief compresses moving water into a confined corridor, shaping currents, temperature layers, and feeding opportunities into an unusually productive strip of sea. Water passing through the channel does not move as a single uniform body. Differences in depth and temperature create gradients along the ledges, while tides concentrate drifting organisms and schooling fish into predictable pathways. For large predators, this geography reduces the vastness of the Gulf into something more manageable. Food arrives through a natural bottleneck, carried past steep contours where an animal capable of reading current and pressure can patrol with remarkable efficiency. Beginning each April and continuing through August, one particular traveler transforms the pass. Adult Atlantic tarpon gather here in extraordinary numbers, with tens of thousands moving through the region during the seasonal aggregation. Their bodies seem built from another chapter of evolutionary history, armored in broad silver scales, powerful through the shoulders, and capable of sudden acceleration. Mature fish commonly weigh between 150 and 200 pounds, while exceptional individuals can exceed 280 pounds. The tarpon are not simply passing through. They feed heavily in these concentrated waters and gather before moving offshore to spawn. Schools can become immense, placing a dense supply of large prey inside a narrow marine passage. Their seasonal arrival has also drawn generations of anglers, making Boca Grande one of the most celebrated tarpon fisheries in the United States. Boats follow the fish across the pass, working the same current seams and underwater contours that have guided predators for far longer. Among those predators are the largest hammerhead sharks on Earth. Great hammerheads are drawn toward the same ledges because the conditions favoring tarpon also favor hunters large enough to pursue them. A hooked tarpon adds another layer to that relationship. Exhaustion can reduce its speed, while struggling movement creates signals that travel through the water. What begins as an encounter between angler and fish can therefore enter an older food web almost immediately. This overlap is not a recent discovery. Scientific documentation of shark depredation at Boca Grande Pass reaches back to 1911, when researchers recorded sharks taking fish associated with the fishery. From that early account to the present, the conflict has remained part of the pass for 115 years, giving Boca Grande the longest documented history of human and hammerhead interaction of this kind in American waters. Over generations, repetition turned observation into local knowledge. Spring brought tarpon, tarpon brought boats, and somewhere beneath them came enormous hammerheads. Their appearance became reliable enough to settle into Florida fishing culture, carried through dockside accounts, photographs, charter stories, and memories of broad dorsal fins cutting across the pass. The legend endured because its foundation was ecological rather than accidental. Great hammerheads did not need the boats in order to find Boca Grande. The pass already offered the ingredients that matter to a roaming predator: concentrated prey, strong tidal movement, steep bottom structure, and a seasonal pulse repeated with enough regularity to reward returning hunters year after year. By late spring, those separate rhythms occupied the same narrow piece of water. Everything converged there. Depth gathered the current, current gathered prey, seasonal instinct gathered tarpon. Anglers gathered around the tarpon, and great hammerheads followed the abundance with a precision shaped by hunger, experience, and the ancient geometry of the pass. Long before the animal acquired a name that fishermen would repeat for decades, reports were already moving along Florida's Gulf Coast. During the 1930s, commercial crews and sport fishermen working between Everglades City and Tampa Bay began describing an unusually large hammerhead. The accounts came from men separated by distance, season, and occupation, yet certain details remained remarkably stable. They spoke of a dark, massive body marked by old injuries, an animal whose appearance seemed increasingly recognizable each time it returned. That consistency gave the stories their weight. Captains aboard different vessels described similar scars without gathering first to establish a shared version. One identifying feature was a notch in the dorsal fin. Later accounts added a distinctive propeller wound across the forehead, remembered as resembling a swastika. These were not measurements glimpsed against an empty horizon, but physical marks that could be recognized when the shark approached closely enough for its damaged skin to become visible. One encounter during the early 1960s added another wound to the growing record. Off Usipa Island, a commercial mullet fisherman found the hammerhead mauling his net. The confrontation shifted when the shark began ramming his 15-foot vessel. At close range, the fisherman struck it with a machete. The blade remained embedded in the fin as the animal moved away, leaving behind damage that fishermen would use as a signature through the following decade. Other encounters carried the same unsettling intimacy. Captain Johnny Downing, an experienced professional captain with decades on the water, was aboard the charter boat Miss Budweiser when his crew hooked a tarpon weighing roughly 100 pounds at Boca Grande Pass. A hammerhead approached the struggling fish and swallowed it whole. Instead of disappearing afterward, the shark passed directly beneath the vessel, giving Downing and several crew members an unusually clear opportunity to judge its length. Downing placed the animal at 20 feet. For men accustomed to estimating large fish beside known boat dimensions, the observation was difficult to dismiss as a fleeting impression. Multiple witnesses aboard the same vessel supported the estimate, while the shark's proximity allowed its proportions to be compared directly with the hull above it. Physical contact became even more extreme in another account. During a close encounter, a captain pushed his outboard engine to full throttle, lifting the bow as the boat accelerated. He aimed the propeller directly into the hammerhead. The spinning blades struck the animal, throwing blood into churned water behind the boat. The shark had been wounded by machinery powerful enough to drive a vessel at speed, yet it remained mobile and eventually swam away. Boca Grande historian Johns Knight Jr. later gathered accounts from captains who had encountered what they believed was the same shark. His documentation preserved an important feature of the tradition. Multiple captains reported the animal during the same season from separate boats and at different hours without coordinating their descriptions beforehand. Again came the immense proportions, the battered body, and recognizable injuries accumulated through years of contact with fishing gear, blades, boats, and propellers. Among the fishing community, the shark became known as Old Hitler, a name born in an era when fishermen often gave memorable animals harsh nicknames. Its identity rested less on the name than on recurrence. Men recognized wounds they had seen before. Captains compared encounters separated by years. A shark that should have vanished into the Gulf kept appearing with familiar damage still written across its body. The fishermen were not struggling to identify the creature beneath their boats. They knew they were dealing with a hammerhead. What remained harder to reconcile was its endurance. Nets, steel, propellers, and direct blows had left marks, but none had ended the encounters. A shark carries no hidden armor beneath its skin. Its durability comes instead from a combination of tissues, scale, body mass, and a capacity to survive injuries that can appear severe from the outside. In a great hammerhead, these features belong to an animal built for continuous movement through open water, not for resisting weapons. Yet together, they can help explain why some large individuals have remained alive after encounters that left conspicuous wounds. Begin beneath the muscle. Like every shark, the great hammerhead possesses a skeleton composed primarily of cartilage rather than true bone. Cartilage is lighter and more flexible than heavily mineralized skeletal tissue, allowing the body to bend efficiently as powerful muscles drive the tail. Parts of the shark skeleton are strengthened by deposits of calcium salts, especially around regions experiencing greater mechanical stress. This does not make a hammerhead immune to blunt trauma, nor does cartilage simply absorb blows that would always fracture bone. Severe impacts can damage cartilage, joints, organs, and surrounding tissues. Its mechanical properties are simply different from those of a bony skeleton, favoring flexibility without eliminating vulnerability. The outer surface adds another unusual structure. Shark skin is covered by dermal denticles, tiny tooth-like structures arranged across the body. Their hard outer layers are related in composition to dental tissues, and their orientation helps control water flowing across the shark as it swims. Viewed closely, the skin resembles a landscape of minute ridges rather than ordinary fish scales. These denticles provide abrasion resistance, but they are not protective plating. A blade or propeller can penetrate the skin and underlying muscle, as scars on wild sharks repeatedly demonstrate. Size changes the consequences of such injuries. Great hammerheads are the largest members of the hammerhead family, and exceptionally large adults can carry enormous body mass. Confirmed specimens around 14 feet have exceeded 1,000 pounds, while estimates for unusually massive individuals can rise higher. On an animal of that scale, a localized cut may involve a smaller proportion of total tissue than the same wound would on a creature weighing 200 pounds. Location and depth matter more than appearance alone. Damage that misses major blood vessels, vital organs, the spinal region, or structures essential for swimming may be survivable even when the resulting scar looks dramatic. Then comes repair. Sharks have been documented recovering from substantial external wounds, sometimes with striking closure of damaged tissue over time. Their healing involves the same broad biological necessities seen across vertebrates, including clotting, inflammation, immune activity, tissue rebuilding, and remodeling. Shark immune systems also contain unusual antibodies and other molecules that researchers have investigated for biomedical and pharmaceutical uses. Those discoveries should not be mistaken for evidence of supernatural healing. Sharks can develop infections, suffer lasting impairment, and die from traumatic injuries. Their recovery remains biology, governed by the severity and location of the damage. For an enormous hammerhead, however, survival can leave a visible history. A propeller strike may carve grooves that later become scars. Fishing gear can penetrate tissue without reaching an immediately fatal structure. Hooks may remain lodged after the line is lost. Each healed injury becomes evidence not that the animal could not be killed, but that the particular wound failed to kill it. That distinction matters when old fishing accounts describe hammerheads returning with damaged fins and scarred heads. Their bodies were not defeating steel. They were surviving specific injuries, then carrying the evidence back into the same waters. Some of the clearest modern examples are preserved in radiographs and examinations of sharks whose faces contained foreign objects long after the original impact, including fragments that had entered through encounters violent enough to leave metal buried inside living tissue. Long before boats entered its world, the great hammerhead had already evolved around a dangerous kind of prey. Stingrays form an important part of its diet, and the shark's unusual head is especially well suited to finding and subduing them. This relationship reaches far deeper into evolutionary time than any encounter with fishing gear. It is a contest between two animals whose bodies carry very different solutions to survival. A stingray can disappear beneath the bottom with remarkable completeness. Its flattened body settles against the seafloor, while movements of the fins and body draw sand across its back until little remains exposed. Large rays may rest beneath several inches of sediment, concealing their outline from predators moving overhead. Their defense is concentrated near the tail, where one or more serrated barbs can turn a close approach into a serious injury. In large stingrays, a tail barb can reach roughly 14 inches. The structure is not simply a pointed spine. Its backward-facing serrations can tear tissue during withdrawal, while venom associated with the barb can intensify pain and injury. Stingray wounds have occasionally proved fatal to humans. For a predator attempting to seize a ray at close range, the tail therefore presents a genuine biological hazard. Great hammerheads approach that problem with the cephalofoil, the broad hammer-shaped structure that gives the family its name. Researchers observing attacks on stingrays have documented a striking method of control. The shark turns the wide head downward and uses it against the ray, pressing prey toward the seafloor. By pinning the body, the hammerhead can restrict movement and reduce the ray's ability to bring its defensive tail into position. Once control is established, feeding can proceed around the safer portions of the prey. Observations have described hammerheads biting into the ray's wing-like pectoral fins, damaging the broad surfaces that generate its swimming motion. Removing or weakening those areas makes escape increasingly difficult. The attack becomes less a single crushing event than a sequence of controlled movements, with the shark using body position and repeated bites to manage prey that remains capable of injuring it. Even this specialized technique does not eliminate risk. Examination of captured great hammerheads has revealed stingray barbs embedded in their tissues. Spines have been reported around the mouth and other parts of the head, sometimes surrounded by healed tissue rather than the appearance of a recent penetration. Such findings preserve an intimate record of earlier hunts. The ray had managed to strike, the barb had remained behind, and the shark had survived long enough for tissue to begin closing around it. Some individuals have carried more than one embedded spine at the same time. The significance lies not merely in survival, but in continued function. A hammerhead bearing old stingray injuries could still swim, locate prey, and feed while foreign material remained lodged within its body. Evolution had not made the animal invulnerable. Instead, natural selection had produced a predator able to operate in a feeding relationship where injury was an ordinary possibility. That distinction gives the old Boca Grande descriptions a biological foundation. The scars fishermen remembered were extraordinary to human eyes, yet damage itself was not foreign to the life of a great hammerhead. Long before steel hooks, machetes, and propellers entered its environment, this shark was pursuing prey armed with serrated, venom-bearing spines. Each successful hunt demanded precise control at intimate range, where a small error could leave a barb buried in living tissue. Beneath the hammer-shaped head, that precision begins with an extraordinary sensory landscape, one capable of revealing prey even when sand and darkness conceal it from ordinary sight. Before a shark touches its prey, the living body has already announced itself. Muscle fibers contract through movements of charged particles across cell membranes, and the heart produces rhythmic electrical activity with every beat. In seawater, these biological signals create extremely weak fields. Sharks possess a sensory system capable of detecting them, giving access to information that human eyes and ears cannot directly perceive. The receptors responsible are called the ampullae of Lorenzini. Across the shark's head, tiny pores open into narrow canals filled with conductive gel. At the inner end of each canal sit sensory cells responsive to minute differences in electrical potential. The system is especially useful at close range, where fields generated by living organisms remain strong enough to distinguish from the electrical background of seawater. For a predator searching along the bottom, that ability can reveal what vision misses. A stingray hidden beneath several inches of sand may leave almost no visible outline, yet respiration, heartbeat, and muscular activity continue beneath the sediment. Those processes create electrical signals. As the shark passes nearby, receptors distributed across its head sample the surrounding field, helping it locate concealed prey closely enough to begin an attack. Hammerheads carry this system across an extraordinary shape. Their cephalofoil spreads the sensory pores over a head far wider than that of a conventionally shaped shark. Instead of concentrating receptors around a narrow snout, the hammer places them across an expanded lateral surface, altering how the animal samples electrical information as it moves. Researchers Stephen Kajiura and Kim Holland examined this sensory arrangement experimentally in hammerhead sharks and compared their performance with narrower-headed species. Their work, published in the Journal of Experimental Biology, showed an important advantage associated with the hammer shape. The wider head increases the area swept by the electrosensory system during movement, allowing a hammerhead to search a broader path without requiring an extraordinary increase in receptor sensitivity itself. That distinction matters. Hammerheads do not possess a magical electrical radar capable of identifying individual prey from hundreds of feet away. Bioelectric fields weaken rapidly with distance, making electroreception primarily a close-range sense. Laboratory studies demonstrate astonishing sensitivity to extremely faint electrical stimuli, but comparisons involving batteries detected across thousands of miles do not accurately describe how biological electric fields propagate through seawater. For a great hammerhead approaching a struggling tarpon, several sensory systems would therefore work together rather than one sense operating alone. Vibrations and low-frequency disturbances produced by the fish can travel through the surrounding water. Chemical traces provide another stream of information. Vision becomes useful under suitable conditions. As the shark closes the remaining distance, electroreception adds increasingly precise information about the living body nearby. A hooked tarpon creates an unusually conspicuous physical disturbance. Repeated bursts of swimming send pressure waves through the water. Turns near the surface displace water differently from the steady movement of an undisturbed fish. Exhaustion changes the rhythm of the struggle. None of this requires the hammerhead to understand fishing. It needs only sensory machinery, refined through evolution, to locate vulnerable prey. From a boat, however, the sequence could appear almost uncanny. The tarpon might still be fighting, while nothing visible disturbed the surface around it. Beneath the hull, sensory information was already available through channels the fishermen themselves could not experience. By the time a dorsal fin or broadhead became visible, the shark had potentially been tracking the disturbance through vibration, scent, sight, and finally the minute electrical signature of living tissue. The Boca Grande fishermen believed great hammerheads could somehow sense a fight before the crew knew a shark was near. Biology gave that observation a foundation, not through one impossible sense, but through several remarkable ones working together. For 2 months in the spring of 2019, Grace Castleberry spent daylight hours above Bahia Honda Channel with binoculars, a long camera lens, and a view of the tarpon fishery below. Fishing guides had been reporting increasing losses of hooked tarpon to great hammerheads, and the pattern had become persistent enough to study directly. What had lived for generations in fishermen's observations was now being recorded event by event. From April into May, Castleberry watched anglers hook 394 tarpon. She recorded the current, tide, fishing activity, duration of each fight, and whether a shark took the fish. Around the channel, researchers also deployed 16 acoustic receivers. Over the broader project, 51 tarpon and 14 great hammerheads carried acoustic transmitters, allowing individual animals to be recognized whenever they passed within detection range. Seen from above, the hammerheads were not merely appearing after a hooked fish began struggling. Fishing captain Kevin Grubb described watching them cruise around the outside of tarpon schools, moving the fish in a manner he compared to a border collie herding sheep. Such behavior did not mean the sharks understood rods, reels, or boats as humans do. It showed that they were already positioning themselves around a seasonal concentration of prey and could exploit disturbances created by fishing when opportunities appeared. Fight duration proved especially important. Tarpon landed quickly, had less time exposed to predators, while prolonged fights increased the chance of loss. For fish fought longer than 5 minutes, the combined rate of observed shark depredation and immediate post-release predation reached 15.3%. Risk was greatest during roughly the first 5 to 12 minutes of a fight and was associated, particularly, with outgoing current. The acoustic record added another layer. Tagged great hammerheads altered their use of Bahia Honda during the tarpon spawning season, increasing their spatial overlap with areas heavily used by tarpon. On outgoing current, their movements became concentrated within a smaller part of the channel, corresponding with places where anglers commonly hooked and fought fish. The same landscape was being used simultaneously by prey, predators, and fishermen, but each was responding to it through a different set of cues. Researchers could identify individual tagged hammerheads as they returned within range of the receiver array. That ability matters because repeated presence creates the conditions for learning. Sharks are capable of associative learning, and a successful feeding event can reinforce behavior that leads to another reward. At Bahia Honda, however, the 2024 study did not demonstrate that each successful strike caused a particular shark to attack again. Its strongest evidence showed repeated seasonal use, spatial overlap, and a clear relationship between longer fight times and predation risk. Even with that distinction, the behavior carries an important implication. A hammerhead does not enter every feeding situation as an empty collection of instincts. Previous encounters can shape future responses. An animal that repeatedly finds vulnerable tarpon around the same seasonal aggregation can retain useful associations with place, timing, current, prey behavior, and opportunities created by fishing. This gives the old Florida accounts a more grounded dimension. A great hammerhead returning to productive water was not simply following an automatic command written into its biology. It could arrive carrying experience accumulated across earlier seasons. Scars recorded what had happened to the body, while memory could preserve something less visible, where food had been found, when it became vulnerable, and which circumstances had ended in a successful meal. The animal beneath the fishing boats was therefore more than powerful anatomy guided by ancient instinct. It was a predator, capable of learning from repetition, adjusting its movements, and returning to places where experience had previously rewarded it. Age in a great hammerhead is written inside the spine. As the shark grows, its vertebrae develop alternating bands within calcified cartilage, leaving a layered record that researchers can examine after death. Thin sections reveal these bands under magnification, and when their timing is validated, counting them allows scientists to reconstruct years that no observer witnessed. For decades, that final condition mattered. A visible band is useful only if researchers know how often it forms. Assuming one band pair represents 1 year can produce convincing ages while still being wrong. Great hammerheads needed an independent clock, something deposited in their bodies at a known moment and preserved there afterward. An unusual event in human history supplied it. Atmospheric nuclear weapons testing during the 1950s and 1960s sharply increased radiocarbon in the atmosphere and surface ocean. Marine food webs absorbed that distinctive pulse. Sharks alive during those decades incorporated its chemical signature into growing vertebral tissue, effectively placing a dated marker inside their skeletons. In 2010, researchers Michelle Passarotti, John Carlson, Andrew Piercy, and Stephen Campana published a validation study in Fishery Bulletin using this bomb-produced radiocarbon signal. They compared radiocarbon measured from selected vertebral growth bands with established marine reference chronologies. The pattern supported annual formation of the bands through at least 42 years of age, providing the first direct validation of age estimates for great hammerheads. A companion study of great hammerheads from the northwestern Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico examined more than 200 animals and reported a maximum estimated age of 44 years. Females grew larger and matured later than males, characteristics that fit a species whose life unfolds slowly. Such longevity also carries a biological cost. Populations cannot rapidly replace large adults when those animals disappear, because reaching maturity and producing new generations requires substantial time. The evidence, therefore, supports great hammerheads living for several decades. Claims of individuals beyond 50 years remain plausible possibilities rather than firmly established records, and reports assigning precise ages to enormous sharks should be treated carefully, unless vertebral analysis or another validated method was actually performed. That caution matters around Boca Grande, where exceptional females have been landed and described in memorable terms. In 2006, a pregnant great hammerhead caught nearby measured more than 14 feet and weighed 1,280 pounds after being brought to shore. Its size alone could not reveal an exact age. Large individuals grow at different rates, and length cannot substitute for reading validated growth bands. Still, the scientifically established lifespan changes how the older fishing accounts can be viewed. A mature hammerhead encountered during one decade could remain alive through many later seasons. A shark aged 44 years would have experienced thousands of tides, migrations, feeding opportunities, storms, and encounters with other animals across a lifetime extending through nearly half a century. For the Boca Grande legend, this creates possibility without proving identity. A scarred shark, seen repeatedly across many years, could indeed have been the same individual if the sightings fell within a biologically realistic lifespan. Yet stories spanning periods longer than validated longevity cannot be assigned to one animal without stronger evidence. Memory, repeated scars on different sharks, and generations of exceptionally large females could merge into a single enduring name. What science adds is subtler than immortality. Great hammerheads live long enough for experience to accumulate across decades, for injuries to become permanent identifiers, and for one animal to become familiar within a human lifetime. A captain could meet a large shark in youth and encounter that same living individual years later, carrying an older body through waters both had known before. Migration leaves no visible trail in open water, yet a tagged shark can turn movement into a record of departures and returns. Receivers placed across coastal waters detect individually coded acoustic transmitters as animals pass nearby. Over months and years, scattered detections accumulate into routes, seasonal ranges, and repeated destinations. For great hammerheads, those records have revealed lives structured by geography with far more consistency than occasional sightings once suggested. Research tracking mature great hammerheads along the southeastern United States has shown that individuals do not all travel alike. Some undertake long seasonal movements, while others remain comparatively restricted, a pattern biologists describe as partial migration. Among the travelers, routes can connect southern Florida with distant portions of the Gulf of Mexico or the Atlantic coast, followed later by movements back toward previously occupied regions. The important detail lies in individuality. Great hammerheads can display persistent preferences for particular ocean basins and seasonal areas. Network analyses of acoustic detections have found sharks whose movements remain associated primarily with the Gulf of Mexico, while others favor Atlantic waters. Rather than behaving as interchangeable members of a wandering population, individual sharks can develop distinct spatial histories that persist across multiple years. Such fidelity does not mean every shark follows an invisible line through exactly the same few feet of ocean. Acoustic receiver networks cannot provide that degree of continuous positional precision. They reveal something broader and more biologically meaningful: repeated use of recognizable regions, migration corridors, and seasonal habitats. A shark departing one area may travel hundreds of miles, then return during another season to waters it has occupied before. Farther southeast, the waters around Bimini in the Bahamas offer another way to recognize returning hammerheads. Researchers there have used photographs to distinguish individuals through natural features, including differences in dorsal fin shape, pigmentation, scars, and other persistent markings. Much as whale researchers use distinctive fins and flukes, shark scientists can build catalogs in which a body becomes its own identification record. Repeated observations at Bimini have shown that recognizable great hammerheads return seasonally to the same general area across multiple years. More than 60 individuals have been cataloged through long-term photographic work, allowing researchers to separate a recurring shark from another animal of similar size. A scar, notch, or fin contour seen again after an absence can reconnect two encounters that would otherwise seem unrelated. This provides a biological framework for understanding how earlier Florida fishermen could recognize particular hammerheads without electronic tags. A distinctive dorsal fin, visible near a boat, could function as a natural marker. Add recurring scars and unusual body features, and recognition becomes increasingly plausible. Combine those marks with the species' capacity for long life and repeated seasonal habitat use, and an individual could become familiar to people working the same waters year after year. That does not prove that every historical sighting attributed to Old Hitler involved one shark. No acoustic transmitter followed that animal, no photographic catalog preserved every encounter, and no genetic sample connects reports across the decades. Science cannot turn a fishing legend into an identified specimen after the evidence has disappeared. Yet the behavior underlying the legend no longer requires an impossible animal. Great hammerheads can live for decades. Individuals can carry recognizable marks. They can display strong seasonal movement patterns and return repeatedly to favored regions. Separate sharks can even develop different geographic preferences within the same population. Seen through that modern evidence, the old captains were describing something biologically credible. A scarred hammerhead could leave Florida waters, move across a vast marine range, and later reappear near familiar feeding grounds. Human witnesses might experience those meetings as isolated moments separated by seasons. For the shark, they could belong to one continuous geography, learned and revisited across years. A certified scale can settle the weight of a shark, but it cannot settle a legend. On May 23, 2006, Clyde Bucky Dennis brought an enormous great hammerhead from Boca Grande waters after a fight lasting roughly 5 hours. The shark had taken a stingray bait and pulled his boat miles into the Gulf before the struggle ended. When weighed, it registered 1,280 pounds. Its measurements were equally formidable. Contemporary reports placed its length between 14 feet 3 inches and 14 feet 6 inches, depending on the measurement cited. The International Game Fish Association ultimately recognized Dennis's catch as the all-tackle world record for great hammerhead, surpassing the previous record by almost 300 pounds. The animal was later donated for scientific study, turning a spectacular fishing achievement into a specimen researchers could examine directly. For anyone outside Boca Grande, such a fish might have seemed large enough to close the old stories. Here was a hammerhead whose mass was established on a scale rather than estimated beside a moving boat. Its dimensions were recorded, its capture witnessed, and its existence beyond dispute. Yet among fishermen familiar with the local tradition, the record did something unexpected. It gave them a measured animal against which the older descriptions could finally be compared. Those descriptions remained larger. Accounts associated with Old Hitler repeatedly placed the legendary shark near 20 feet, with an immense hammer-shaped head and a body carrying scars accumulated across encounters. Local observers described proportions exceeding those of Dennis's record animal. The difference did not prove that such a shark existed, but the record catch demonstrated how enormous a verified Boca Grande great hammerhead could actually become. Dennis reinforced that point only a few years later. In 2009, not 2014 as some later retellings suggest, he landed another exceptional hammerhead from Boca Grande. This shark measured 13 feet 6 inches and weighed roughly 1,060 pounds. It was another immense individual from the same remarkably productive waters, yet still smaller than his world record fish. By then, Boca Grande had produced several record-class hammerheads across different decades. The pattern mattered more than any single catch. These were not distant estimates from unidentified shapes offshore. They were landed animals whose dimensions could be documented. Each one established another point inside the known size range of great hammerheads living around the pass. Local fishing tradition nevertheless kept a distinction between those verified giants and Old Hitler. Veteran captains were not required to deny the records in order to preserve the legend. They could look at a 14-foot shark weighing well above half a ton and accept both realities at once. The animal before them was extraordinary, and it still did not match what earlier witnesses claimed to have seen. Captain Greg Penix expressed the local interpretation in terms of an Old Hitler giant shark gene pool. His phrase captured something broader than belief in one immortal individual. Boca Grande repeatedly attracts unusually large great hammerheads, creating generation after generation of encounters capable of renewing an older story. The records therefore narrowed the distance between folklore and biology without erasing it. A 1,280-pound hammerhead was no longer an estimate whispered at a dock. It had existed, been weighed, and entered an official record book. Yet claims of a 20-foot, 2,000-pound individual remained claims beyond what those catches could verify. The world record did not reveal Old Hitler. It established a measured boundary beneath the legend, showing that Boca Grande truly could produce hammerheads of exceptional size while leaving the greatest historical estimates unresolved. Size becomes difficult to judge when only part of an animal breaks the surface. A dorsal fin offers height and shape, but conceals the mass beneath it. For Boca Grande captains, this was often how the largest hammerheads first entered view, not as complete bodies beside a measuring tape, but as tall fins moving through the pass while the rest remained submerged. The great hammerhead, scientifically named Sphyrna mokaran, is the largest living member of the hammerhead family. Its proportions become increasingly imposing with age. Adults commonly encountered by researchers and divers occupy a range around 10 to 14 feet, while exceptional specimens grow substantially longer. Reports from scientific and fisheries literature place the upper reaches of the species near 20 feet, although measurements become increasingly scarce at those extremes. That scarcity creates an important divide between confirmed specimens and credible observations. Sharks landed, examined, or measured under controlled circumstances provide the strongest records. Animals observed beside boats or underwater can offer useful estimates, particularly when experienced witnesses have known dimensions for comparison, but those estimates carry greater uncertainty. A living shark bends, turns, changes depth, and rarely presents its entire length along a fixed reference. The Boca Grande world record illustrates the distinction. At roughly 14.5 feet and 1,280 pounds, Clyde Bucky Dennis's great hammerhead was an extraordinary animal, yet its length remained below the largest measurements reported for the species. Length alone also does not translate neatly into weight. As a shark grows, its mass increases in 3 dimensions, so a substantially longer animal cannot be estimated by simply adding pounds at the same rate as inches. A 20-foot great hammerhead could therefore weigh far more than a 14-foot individual, potentially approaching or exceeding 2,000 pounds, depending on its sex, condition, girth, and body proportions. That possibility places the traditional old Hitler estimates within a biologically conceivable range, but it does not verify them. No scale ever recorded the legendary animal, and no standardized measurement fixed its length while it was alive. One feature could nevertheless make an exceptionally large great hammerhead conspicuous before its body appeared. The first dorsal fin of Sphyrnomocharan is unusually tall and strongly curved, with a sickle-shaped profile characteristic of the species. On a large adult, that fin can rise prominently above the back. When the shark swims near the surface, the visible portion may become the first clue that something substantial is passing beneath the water. For fishermen familiar with ordinary hammerheads, proportion mattered. They had seen dorsal fins beside hulls, watched sharks circle hooked fish, and landed animals whose dimensions later became known. An unusually tall fin could therefore create an immediate impression of scale, even before the head or tail became visible. Such experience improves estimation, though it never removes the uncertainty inherent in observing a moving animal from above. This is where the old Hitler accounts remain suspended between biological possibility and historical proof. Great hammerheads can reach exceptional lengths. Their body mass at those lengths can become enormous. Their distinctive dorsal fins can allow experienced observers to recognize both species and unusual size from the surface. Nothing in the anatomy requires a 20-foot individual to be imaginary. Yet, possibility is not measurement. Without a captured specimen, reliable calibrated photographs, or direct scientific measurements, no surviving evidence can establish that one particular Boca Grande hammerhead reached the dimensions attributed to it. The legend occupies the narrow space between what witnesses consistently remembered and what the species is physically capable of becoming. By the late 20th century, however, exceptionally large hammerheads faced pressures extending far beyond Florida fishing grounds. Their enormous fins had acquired value in an international trade, turning the biological achievement of reaching great size into a liability across the world's oceans. While Florida fishermen were giving names to individual giants, an entirely different accounting system was spreading across the oceans. By the late 20th century, a hammerhead was no longer valuable only as a sport fish, a source of meat, or an imposing catch brought back to a dock. Its fins had become commodities within an international market, and the largest sharks carried some of the most desirable ones. Hammerhead fins became particularly valued in the shark fin trade because of their large size and high concentration of fin rays. In Hong Kong, historically one of the principal trading centers, hammerhead fins commanded premium prices for use in shark fin soup. Great hammerheads shared this commercial pressure with scalloped and smooth hammerheads, whose fins were often difficult to distinguish once removed and processed. The scale extended far beyond any single port. Longline fisheries spread thousands of baited hooks across tropical and subtropical seas, catching sharks both deliberately and incidentally alongside other commercially valuable species. Estimates derived from Hong Kong trade records indicated that more than 1 million scalloped and smooth hammerheads alone could enter the fin trade annually during periods of intense exploitation. Great hammerheads were added to that pressure through targeted fishing and bycatch throughout much of their range. For a species built around slow growth and long life, losses accumulated faster than replacement. Historical reconstructions have documented severe hammerhead declines in several regions, though exact percentages differ among species, datasets, and time periods. Analyses from the northwestern Atlantic reported reductions approaching or exceeding 90% in some hammerhead populations after decades of fishing pressure. Comparable collapses appeared elsewhere, while Mediterranean hammerheads became exceptionally scarce across areas where they had once been regularly recorded. The Gulf of Mexico was not isolated from this transformation. Commercial fisheries, recreational harvest, accidental capture, and international demand all removed sharks from waters connected to the same migration routes used by Florida animals. A hammerhead returning seasonally to coastal feeding grounds still had to survive everything encountered during the rest of its movements. Familiarity with one pass offered no protection hundreds of miles away. Size made the oldest animals especially conspicuous to fisheries. A mature great hammerhead carries large fins, and large fins have historically commanded substantial commercial value. Removing these adults also removes individuals that have already survived the long journey to reproductive maturity. In a population where females require years to mature, the disappearance of a large breeding animal represents far more than the loss of a single body. By 2019, the International Union for Conservation of Nature assessed the great hammerhead as critically endangered, reflecting severe global population reduction driven principally by fishing mortality. The category places the species among animals facing an extremely high risk of extinction in the wild. Its reputation as a formidable predator had offered little defense against industrial fishing effort operating across entire ocean basins. This changes the atmosphere surrounding the older Boca Grande accounts. During the 1960s and 1970s, fishermen could still encounter enormous hammerheads from generations that had developed under very different levels of exploitation. As those decades passed, the surrounding population was being steadily reshaped. Large adults disappeared, younger sharks faced continued fishing pressure, and the probability of any individual surviving long enough to reach exceptional size diminished. The giants remembered by veteran captains belonged to an ecological world that was already contracting around them. Their scars suggested resilience against prey, hooks, blades, and boats, but none of those defenses addressed the larger arithmetic of sustained harvest. An animal could survive individual wounds and return season after season, yet still belong to a population losing members faster than biology could replace them. The shark fishermen struggled to catch had become rare, while memories of it were still being formed. Recovery begins with a delay. Before a female great hammerhead can contribute even one new generation, she must survive years of growth through coastal and offshore waters. Sexual maturity arrives only after the body has reached substantial size, commonly around 8 to 10 feet for females, though estimates vary among populations and studies. Until then, every juvenile lost to fishing removes an animal that never had the chance to reproduce. Maturity does not bring rapid replacement. Great hammerheads are viviparous, nourishing developing young internally before giving birth to fully formed pups. Gestation lasts about 11 months, and reported litters range from roughly 6 to more than 40 young. Evidence indicates a reproductive cycle of about 2 years, so even a healthy adult female cannot replace losses with annual litters. Birth begins an entirely independent existence. Newborn hammerheads receive no prolonged parental care after entering the water. They swim away, equipped to feed and navigate for themselves, often using productive coastal habitats where smaller prey is available. Their mother does not remain to guard them, teach them to hunt, or shield them from larger predators. Survival immediately depends on the young shark's own behavior and on the condition of the habitat around it. That life history works when adult survival is naturally high. A long-lived predator does not need to produce enormous numbers of offspring if mature animals persist through many breeding cycles. Heavy fishing reverses that balance. When adults are removed faster than surviving juveniles can mature, reproduction falls behind mortality, and the population begins losing the very animals responsible for rebuilding it. Population recovery, therefore, depends not merely on births, but on enough young animals surviving the long interval before reproduction begins. Great hammerheads face another difficulty when captured. Among large sharks, they are exceptionally vulnerable to the physiological stress of fighting fishing gear. Studies of commercial longline capture have recorded very high at-vessel mortality, in some cases exceeding 90%. Other fisheries and capture methods produce different outcomes, so this figure should not be applied to every recreational release. Even so, the species is recognized as unusually sensitive to capture stress, making prolonged fights and handling especially consequential. The largest females carry disproportionate reproductive importance. An adult that survives for decades may produce many litters across her lifetime. Removing her does more than reduce the population by one shark. It also erases the future offspring she might have produced through every breeding cycle that would have followed. Boca Grande provided a stark example in 2006 when the enormous female, landed by Clyde Bucky Dennis, was found to be pregnant with 55 pups. That number exceeded the litter sizes commonly reported in scientific summaries and showed how much reproductive potential can be concentrated inside a single mature animal. Her capture removed the mother and an unusually large developing litter at once. Across a heavily depleted population, losses like these accumulate through time. A juvenile must first survive long enough to mature. A mature female then requires nearly a year to complete gestation, followed by another interval before reproducing again. Her offspring begin life without parental protection, while fishing pressure can operate across nursery grounds, migration routes, feeding areas, and offshore habitat. This is why protection does not produce an immediate return of giant hammerheads. Even after mortality declines, biology continues at its inherited pace. Missing adults cannot be recreated in a few seasons, and the oldest breeding females require decades to replace. Recovery must pass through the bodies of young sharks, growing year after year, surviving long enough to become the reproductive adults that earlier generations lost. A population can shrink long before its disappearance becomes visible. In genetics, that contraction leaves another kind of record, written not in scars or missing animals, but in the arrangement of inherited variation. When scientists began reading the great hammerhead genome at chromosome scale, they found evidence that the species had been losing genetic breadth across a history far older than modern fishing. The work was led by Michael Stanhope of Cornell University, with researchers from several institutions, and was released in late 2022 before appearing in the journal iScience in January 2023. The team assembled chromosome-level genomes for the great hammerhead and the shortfin mako, then compared patterns of genetic diversity, inbreeding, and historical effective population size with those of other sharks. For the great hammerhead, the result was concerning. Its genome showed low heterozygosity, meaning relatively little variation between corresponding copies of inherited genetic material. Long stretches, called runs of homozygosity, appeared throughout the genome. These regions form when both chromosome copies contain matching sequences inherited through shared ancestry, and unusually long runs can indicate relatively recent inbreeding. More than 8% of the examined great hammerhead genome occurred in runs longer than 1 million genetic building blocks. When shorter runs were included, the proportion became far larger. Compared with the shortfin mako examined in the same research, the hammerhead carried substantially stronger genomic signs of inbreeding. Yet, the genetic record did not point only toward recent human pressure. Reconstructing historical effective population size revealed a steep decline extending across roughly the last 250,000 years. That timescale reaches far beyond industrial fishing and the international fin trade. Great hammerheads therefore appear to have entered the modern era with a genetic history already shaped by ancient population contraction, possibly influenced by environmental and ecological changes that remain incompletely understood. Modern exploitation was added to that older vulnerability rather than creating it from nothing. When fishing rapidly removes adults from an already reduced population, fewer individuals contribute genes to future generations. Rare genetic variants can disappear by chance. Related animals may become more likely to reproduce, and the population can lose some of the diversity that helps species respond to disease, environmental change, and other pressures. For the Boca Grande story, this genetic erosion adds a different meaning to the disappearance of giants. Genes do not contain a simple switch for producing a 20-foot hammerhead. Maximum body size emerges from many interacting influences, including numerous genes, sex, development, food availability, health, age, and environmental conditions. The genome study did not demonstrate that reduced diversity has lowered the species' maximum attainable size, nor can the world record be treated as a modern genetic ceiling. What has been lost is possibility in a broader and more defensible sense. Every severe population reduction removes individuals carrying particular combinations of genetic variants. Once those combinations vanish without descendants, evolution cannot simply restore them on demand. A population may recover numerically while still retaining less genetic variation than existed before the collapse. Conservation genetics therefore changes the scale of what recovery means. Protecting surviving sharks can allow births to exceed losses, but rebuilding genetic richness is slower and, for variants already extinct, impossible without some surviving source. The immense hammerheads remembered from earlier generations belong to a larger biological inheritance, one containing more individuals and, potentially, combinations no longer represented among survivors. Whether any vanished combination contributed to exceptional size cannot now be reconstructed. The genomic evidence preserves no portrait of old Hitler. It reveals something more fundamental. Survival of the species and preservation of its full evolutionary potential are not necessarily the same thing. For a generation of fishermen, the disappearance happened gradually enough to feel almost ordinary. Encounters became less frequent, enormous fins appeared less often, and stories inherited from older captains began to sound increasingly detached from the water beneath their boats. Then, across the closing years of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st, the pattern began shifting again. Protections accumulated slowly. United States fisheries adopted tighter restrictions on hammerheads, while international trade received greater scrutiny. In 2014, great hammerheads were listed under Appendix 2 of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, requiring international trade to be controlled so it would not further threaten the species. Their later recognition as critically endangered reflected how severe the global decline had become. None of those measures restored the old population overnight. A shark that matures slowly and reproduces at long intervals cannot rebuild on a human timetable. Yet, reduced fishing mortality can allow more animals to survive long enough to mature, reproduce, learn productive feeding grounds, and return to them. In parts of Florida, that survival began creating an unexpected consequence for people fishing the same waters. The evidence arrived through missing tarpon. At Bahia Honda in the Florida Keys, fishing guides reported increasing encounters in which large sharks took hooked tarpon before anglers could bring them alongside their boats. Those observations helped motivate research that followed hundreds of hookups and examined when depredation occurred. The resulting work documented a pattern that sounded familiar to generations of fishermen farther north at Boca Grande. Great hammerheads were not merely wandering into struggling fish by chance. They positioned themselves around tarpon activity and exploited the predictable vulnerability created by a prolonged fight. Once a hooked tarpon remained on the line beyond 5 minutes, its chances of being taken rose sharply. Across the observations analyzed by researchers, approximately 15.3% of tarpon hooked for longer than 5 minutes were lost to sharks. The increasing encounters did not necessarily indicate an ecosystem becoming unhealthy. They could also reflect the return of predators to places where decades of exploitation had made them scarce. Conservation can produce such reversals. Success does not always look like an untouched animal moving somewhere beyond human experience. Sometimes it appears beside a fishing boat, taking advantage of precisely the opportunity that generations of its species learned to recognize. Around Boca Grande, that possibility carries an older resonance. Veteran captains have described large hammerheads moving through the pass again, appearing near tarpon boats and slipping toward the deep contours below. Younger guides encounter animals performing behaviors that belong to stories told long before their own careers began. The population remains far below its historical abundance, and reduced genetic diversity cannot be restored merely by increasing local sightings. Yet an ecological relationship once fading from living memory has become visible again. That makes the old legend strangely difficult to bury. Old Hitler need not have survived into the present for something recognizable to return. The name belonged to a particular story, but the behavior beneath it belonged to a species capable of learning, remembering productive places, surviving for decades, and revisiting seasonal feeding grounds. A century after the earliest accounts, tarpon still gather, fishing lines still tighten, and broad-headed predators still learn what those struggles mean. Conservation has not resurrected the shark the fisherman named. It has allowed fragments of the world that created that shark to reappear. And beneath the legend rests its oldest unresolved fact. For all the hooks, heavy tackle, boats, captains, records, scars, sightings, and generations spent pursuing it, the animal remembered as Old Hitler was never landed. A fishing line does not know the difference between a legendary shark and an ordinary load. It responds only to tension, acceleration, abrasion, and the strength of its weakest point. At Boca Grande Pass, those simple mechanical limits helped create an animal that generations of fishermen could encounter repeatedly without ever bringing it alongside a boat. Tarpon tackle was built around tarpon. Even exceptionally large fish belonged to a weight class far below the immense hammerhead described in the oldest accounts. A shark approaching 2,000 pounds could outweigh a 200-pound tarpon by roughly 10 times. But weight alone was only part of the problem. Once that mass accelerated through moving water, momentum rose rapidly. A sudden turn, dive, or surge transferred force through the remaining fish, leader, hook, knots, rod, and reel. Whichever component reached its limit first surrendered. The shark did not need to remain attached for long. Great hammerheads hunting hooked prey are interested in the struggling animal, not the fishing gear connected to it. An experienced predator can approach from below or behind, seize the tarpon, and remove flesh or the entire fish without taking the hook into its own mouth. What the angler feels may be a violent increase in load followed almost immediately by release. The line parts, the leader is severed, or the damaged tarpon disappears with the shark. That difference matters. Catching a predator intentionally requires placing a suitable hook where the predator can become securely connected to tackle designed to withstand it. Depredation creates the opposite arrangement. The hook is already inside the prey. The shark arrives after the system has been assembled for another species and simply takes advantage of it. In mechanical terms, the fisherman begins the encounter with the wrong equipment already committed to the wrong animal. Boca Grande adds another advantage beneath the hull. The pass reaches depths near 75 feet within a remarkably confined channel, while strong tidal flow moves through steep underwater contours. A large hammerhead, taking a tarpon near the surface, can turn downward and reach deeper structure within moments. Line pulled across a ledge or rough bottom gains an additional enemy, abrasion. Even tackle capable of surviving direct tension can fail rapidly when dragged against hard structure under load. Attempts to find a shark matching the old descriptions continued as heavier animals were landed elsewhere along Florida's Gulf Coast. During the 1982 Greater Suncoast Shark Tournament, fishermen brought in a hammerhead weighing 991 pounds off Sarasota. By ordinary standards, it was enormous. Yet captains familiar with the Boca Grande stories still regarded it as smaller than the animal they remembered. Their repeated failure did not require anything supernatural. It required an unusually large predator entering an encounter on favorable terms. The shark selected the moment, attacked, tackle intended for smaller prey, often avoided the hook entirely, and possessed immediate access to deep, moving water and structure. Technology could increase line strength and hook size, but it could not erase that asymmetry. The fishermen were trying to convert an ambush into a contest after the decisive movement had already occurred. By the time a reel began losing line, the shark had often completed the act that brought it there. So, the uncaught animal remained defined less by invulnerability than by circumstance. Size supplied force, experience supplied precision, and the pass supplied an exit. Across decades, those three advantages could turn ordinary failures of metal, fiber, timing, and human reaction into something remembered as impossible to land. And with each broken connection, the pursuit became larger than the equipment itself, binding generations of fishermen to an animal they could measure only by what it left behind. The coastline visible from a boat is only a narrow edge of the territory a great hammerhead can occupy. For generations, accounts around Boca Grande placed the great shark within a familiar map of passes, bays, islands, and fishing grounds. Modern tracking has widened that map until the animal no longer belongs to a single stretch of Florida water, but to an oceanic corridor extending far beyond the horizon. In 2011, University of Miami research professor Neil Hammerschlag and his colleagues achieved the first successful satellite tracking of a great hammerhead. The transmitter remained with the shark for 62 days, turning an animal once followed only by sightings into a moving point across the western Atlantic. Its path began near South Florida, then carried northeast into open water until the shark reached a position off New Jersey. Measured as a straight line, the displacement covered 745 miles. The actual swimming path was longer, shaped by current, direction changes, and the contours of the ocean itself. Most revealing was the route. Rather than moving randomly through offshore water, the hammerhead entered the Gulf Stream, the immense warm current flowing northward along the eastern United States before bending toward the open Atlantic. For a traveling shark, that current is more than moving water. It is a broad transport corridor with distinctive temperature boundaries, prey concentrations, and energetic advantages. Swimming with favorable flow can reduce the effort required to cover great distances, while the edges of major currents gather biological activity into productive zones. The tracked hammerhead was therefore moving through a landscape invisible from shore, one defined not by roads or coastlines, but by water masses in motion. Hammerschlag and his colleagues regarded the journey as a confirmed extension of the known range for the species. A great hammerhead associated with subtropical Florida had traveled farther north than previous records had securely documented, demonstrating how incomplete a map built from captures and occasional observations could be. Later tracking added another layer. A study published in 2025 in the Journal of Fish Biology followed 15 mature great hammerheads tagged around Florida between 2019 and 2022. Their movements revealed distinct migration strategies. Sharks entering the Gulf of Mexico did not simply mirror those moving into the Atlantic. Individuals repeatedly favored one basin, displaying what researchers described as oceanic basin affinity. That consistency transforms the scale of the Boca Grande stories. An individual appearing near the pass during spring did not necessarily spend the rest of its year nearby. It could travel hundreds of miles through entirely different waters, crossing temperature gradients, current systems, feeding areas, and heavily altered coastlines before eventually approaching southwestern Florida again. Such movement also changes what it means for a shark to possess a home range. Great hammerheads can operate across enormous geographic spaces while remaining faithful to particular seasonal destinations. Their world is expansive without being shapeless. Certain corridors matter. Certain basins remain preferred. Particular feeding grounds can be revisited after months spent elsewhere. An animal remembered from one pass might therefore have belonged, for much of the year, to another coastline entirely. The fishermen saw only the brief intersection between its migration and their own season, a recurring appointment inside a journey far larger than anyone watching from a tarpon boat could reconstruct. Yet returning across that distance requires more than endurance. Somewhere within the hammerhead sensory world lies the ability to preserve direction across open water and relocate useful places after immense journeys. With the broad architecture of its head potentially contributing to a navigational system, science is still learning to read. Landmarks disappear quickly in open water. A coastline can fall below the horizon. The seafloor can sink beyond useful vision, and familiar channels can be separated by hundreds of miles of ocean. Yet a great hammerhead returning season after season can relocate a remarkably specific part of that enormous space. Memory alone cannot explain the journey if memory depends only on what the eyes can recognize. One possible guide is present everywhere the shark travels. Earth is surrounded by a magnetic field whose strength and angle vary gradually across the planet. Those variations create a kind of geographic information. Animals able to detect them can potentially use magnetic intensity and inclination as components of an internal map, gaining directional information even when visual landmarks are absent. Experiments with sharks have shown that they respond to changes in magnetic fields and can use magnetic information during orientation. In controlled studies, researchers exposed sharks to magnetic conditions resembling locations displaced from their capture area. The animals altered their swimming direction in ways consistent with navigation, evidence that at least some shark species can extract positional information from Earth's magnetic field. Exactly how sharks sense that information remains unresolved. The ampullae of Lorenzini are compelling candidates because their gel-filled canals are exquisitely sensitive to weak electrical signals. As a shark moves through seawater within Earth's magnetic field, electromagnetic induction can generate tiny electrical effects that such receptors may be capable of detecting. Other mechanisms have also been proposed, and scientists have not yet established that the ampullae alone provide the magnetic sense. For the great hammerhead, the shape of the head adds another intriguing possibility. Its cephalofoil distributes ampullary pores across an unusually broad surface. That arrangement clearly expands the area sampled during electrical detection of prey. Whether it also improves magnetic navigation has not been demonstrated directly, but the geometry could provide the nervous system with spatially separated sensory inputs while the shark changes direction through the surrounding field. Navigation at sea is unlikely to depend on one signal alone. Magnetic information can operate alongside current direction, temperature, chemical traces, depth, celestial cues near the surface, and learned features encountered along familiar routes. Together, these sources could allow a mature shark to correct its course repeatedly rather than follow a single invisible line across the ocean. That distinction matters when considering site fidelity. A shark returning to Boca Grande does not need an internal coordinate written with human precision. It needs a sensory system capable of recognizing when its movement is carrying it toward a remembered region, then refining its position as local information becomes stronger. Broad magnetic cues may guide the long migration. Nearer the coast, currents, bottom contours, odors, prey activity, and other familiar signals can narrow the search until a particular channel or ledge becomes recognizable again. Such layered navigation fits the movements revealed by tracking. A great hammerhead can leave Florida, travel hundreds of miles through open water, spend months elsewhere, and later reappear within a seasonal range it has used before. The achievement is not a single act of instinct. It is continuous orientation, comparison, correction, and memory performed inside a moving ocean. Seen this way, the recurring shark of Boca Grande becomes less mysterious without becoming less remarkable. Its return did not require a supernatural attachment to one pass. A long-lived predator could carry a learned geographic history through migrations, using planetary signals for broad direction and local sensory detail for the final approach. The same animal could therefore occupy an immense marine range while remaining exquisitely faithful to one profitable place within it. At the upper edge of a predator community, abundance can become almost beside the point. One sufficiently large animal may occupy a feeding corridor so effectively that its presence shapes where others hunt, when they approach, and how long they remain. For a mature great hammerhead, life at that scale is largely solitary. There is no pack surrounding it, no coordinated hunt, and no permanent group sharing the rewards of a productive stretch of water. Great hammerheads may gather temporarily where food or seasonal conditions concentrate them, but mature individuals generally forage alone. Their encounters with one another do not resemble the cooperative hunting of killer whales or the organized pursuit of wolves. Each shark carries its own history of successful routes and feeding opportunities. Where several individuals use the same broader region, their movements can be separated through time and space, limiting direct competition for the richest opportunities. Long-term observations around Bimini in the Bahamas have made that individuality especially visible. Researchers, identifying great hammerheads from distinctive dorsal fins and other markings, repeatedly documented particular animals returning to the region. Yet, those recognizable sharks did not simply move as one persistent aggregation. Individuals showed distinct patterns of presence, occupying the same marine landscape without behaving as a stable hunting society. Familiar water could therefore hold several known hammerheads, while each remained, in ecological terms, largely its own unit. Size changes the balance within those encounters. A fully grown great hammerhead carries advantages that accumulate over decades. Greater body mass allows it to handle larger prey, cover demanding routes, and contest feeding opportunities with smaller sharks. Large individuals can displace lesser competitors from profitable areas simply because challenging them carries greater cost. Dominance does not require elaborate cooperation. Sometimes, the difference between staying and yielding is written directly into the proportions of the animals involved. That gives the old accounts from Boca Grande another biological dimension. If one hammerhead truly reached the extreme size repeatedly attributed to old Hitler, its significance would not depend upon a surrounding population of equally enormous sharks. The opposite is more plausible. An exceptional individual could have occupied the highest position within a corridor visited by many predators, arriving during the seasonal concentration of tarpon and encountering smaller hammerheads that were capable hunters in their own right, yet still subordinate when the larger animal appeared. Such a shark would not need to defend Boca Grande Pass like a land animal guarding a fenced territory. Marine ranges are fluid, and great hammerheads travel far beyond any single feeding ground. Dominance can instead emerge through repeated use. An experienced individual returns when prey is abundant, exploits the most profitable locations, and temporarily alters the behavior of competitors sharing that space. Once it departs, the corridor remains available to others until seasonal movement brings it back. From a boat, that pattern could easily acquire the appearance of ownership. Captains would see different hammerheads throughout the season, then occasionally recognize one animal whose proportions, scars, and behavior placed it apart from everything else. Smaller sharks might come and go without becoming part of local memory. The exceptional individual would be remembered because every encounter reinforced the same identity. Old Hitler, if the reports preserved a real shark, therefore did not need to represent a hidden population of giants. A single long-lived animal was enough. Its rarity was part of its ecological position. In a narrow, prey-rich passage, enormous size, experience, and solitary feeding could converge in one recurring predator, leaving generations of fishermen with the impression that the pass itself had one unmistakable master. A predator can change an ecosystem without making a kill. Its influence begins earlier, in the movements of prey that know where danger tends to gather. Around Boca Grande Pass, a great hammerhead weighing close to 2,000 pounds would have exerted that influence simply by returning to a productive feeding corridor. Tarpon entering the pass would not encounter an empty landscape. They would enter water shaped by the repeated presence of an animal capable of taking them. Ecologists describe such effects through the idea of a trophic cascade. Predators remove prey, but they also change prey behavior. Fish exposed to concentrated predation may alter depth, spacing, timing, and movement, especially where geography funnels predator and prey together. A tarpon school that compresses, descends, or shifts its passage through a channel changes where smaller organisms are pursued. Those prey respond in turn, carrying the influence farther through the food web without ever encountering the original predator. The effect is rarely simple enough to trace as a single descending chain. Coastal ecosystems contain overlapping relationships among sharks, rays, large fishes, smaller predators, grazers, and the habitats supporting them. Removing an apex predator can release some mid-level consumers from pressure, alter competition, and redistribute feeding across habitats. In marine systems around the world, researchers have documented ecological reorganizations after large predators declined, although the strength and direction of each cascade depend on local species and conditions. By 2021, a global analysis of oceanic sharks and rays had reconstructed a severe transformation in abundance. Since 1970, their populations had fallen by 71%, while relative fishing pressure increased 18-fold. The loss represented more than fewer large bodies moving through open water. It meant fewer predators performing ecological roles that had developed within marine communities over immense spans of evolutionary time. Along Florida's Gulf Coast, memories preserved by older fishing families describe an abundance difficult to reconstruct from modern experience. Tarpon arrived in immense seasonal concentrations. Large sharks appeared often enough to become expected participants in the fishery rather than exceptional visitors. Hammerheads could take hooked fish beside boats, while other predators worked the same gatherings from below and along the edges. The pass functioned as a compressed feeding arena where current, depth, prey density, and migration repeatedly brought large animals together. Within such a system, an exceptionally large hammerhead would have occupied more than physical space. Its hunting could remove individual tarpon, but its greater ecological reach came through behavior. Prey adjusting their routes around a dominant predator would redistribute feeding pressure elsewhere. Smaller sharks, encountering an animal above them in the hierarchy, might alter their own use of the corridor. Even periods when the giant failed to capture anything could matter, because avoidance itself changes where energy moves through an ecosystem. That makes the old Boca Grande stories valuable in a way their tellers may never have intended. Beneath the oversized fins, broken tackle, and remembered encounters lies a record of an ecosystem containing far more large predators than many coastal waters support today. Old Hitler belonged to that former abundance, whether the name followed one extraordinary shark or accumulated around repeated encounters with a rare individual. When an animal at that level disappears, the water does not preserve an obvious empty space. Other fish continue migrating, tides continue crossing the pass, boats return with each tarpon season. Yet, relationships among predators and prey can shift, gradually producing a coastline that still looks familiar while functioning differently beneath the surface. What vanished was not merely a giant hammerhead. It was part of the living structure that once made such a giant possible. Boca Grande Pass has outlived every fisherman who first gave its giant shark a name. The channel remains, carved between Gasparilla Island and Cayo Costa, carrying Gulf water across steep bottom contours, while spring gathers tarpon into the same narrow geography. Boats still assemble above those ledges each season. Beneath them, great hammerheads still arrive. Yet the animals moving through that familiar structure now belong to an ocean altered by the decades between the earliest stories and the present. Acoustic telemetry from 2019 through 2022 followed 15 mature, great hammerheads across southeastern United States waters. The tracked sharks ranged from roughly 7 to 11 feet in fork length. These were substantial predators, fully capable of taking large prey and traveling immense seasonal routes, but their measured dimensions remained far below the extreme proportions attached to the oldest Boca Grande accounts. Modern instruments can follow their movements with precision unavailable to earlier captains, and the resulting picture contains both recovery and absence. Encounters around hooked tarpon have become more frequent in parts of Florida. Guides who spend hundreds of days on the water notice the change directly, not through population models, but through interrupted fights, bitten fish, and hammerheads appearing beside their boats. Conservation has allowed more sharks to survive in waters where previous generations watched them decline. A predator that seemed to be fading from ordinary experience has begun reclaiming portions of its former range. Still, abundance and age structure are not the same thing. A recovering population can contain more individuals while remaining depleted of exceptionally old, exceptionally large animals. Great hammerheads need decades to approach the far end of their potential lifespan and size. Every mature shark removed before reaching that stage erases years of possible growth. When heavy fishing pressure persists across generations, the population can become younger even before its total numbers reveal the full change. That distinction can be felt at Boca Grande. The tarpon migration continues each spring. Hammerheads follow the seasonal concentration. Captains encounter impressive sharks and sometimes lose fish to them within moments. But among families whose memories span generations, there remains a difference between a large hammerhead and the kind of animal described by fathers and grandfathers. Their comparison is not necessarily a rejection of modern recovery. It is a measure of how much the historical baseline has shifted. The deepest ledges still descend to roughly 75 feet. Current still presses through the pass, gathering prey along edges and drop-offs where predators can exploit them. Physical habitat has preserved the stage with remarkable fidelity. Biology has changed the cast. Reduced genetic diversity adds another layer. Population recovery measured by numbers alone cannot immediately restore combinations of genes lost when breeding adults disappeared, nor can protection instantly recreate an age structure containing many sharks that have survived 30, 40, or 50 years. Such animals require uninterrupted time. Their scars accumulate slowly, as do the learned routes and feeding habits that make an old predator different from a younger one of the same species. So Boca Grande Pass remains capable of producing encounters that resemble fragments of its older reputation. A broad head may appear beside a hooked tarpon. A tall dorsal fin may cross the surface. A fish may vanish before an angler understands what intercepted it. The pattern survives, even if its largest participant does not. What remains is a place carrying two versions of itself at once: the living past of the present and the remembered abundance preserved in generations of testimony. The distance between them is measured not in geography, but in what the water once had enough time, diversity, and life to grow. The name came from a particular historical moment, when language along the Gulf Coast was being shaped by events far beyond Florida. During the early years of the Second World War, Adolf Hitler represented destruction, aggression, and an enemy that seemed capable of reaching across borders with terrifying force. Fishermen confronting an enormous shark they could neither land nor reliably drive away borrowed that name for an adversary of an entirely different kind. Their choice reveals more about the people on the boats than about the animal beneath them. A great hammerhead has no concept of ownership, insult, victory, or defeat. It does not know that a tarpon attached to a fishing line has become someone else's catch. The shark recognizes opportunity through movement, electrical signals, scent, and experience. When prey becomes vulnerable, the distinction between a naturally injured fish and one exhausted beside a boat has no moral meaning. To the fishermen, however, the encounter unfolded inside a human system of expectations. They had selected the bait, fought the tarpon, maintained the tackle, and brought the fish close enough to claim success. Then, another animal entered that sequence and erased the expected ending. Lines parted. Tarpon vanished. A broad shape passed beneath the hull and returned to depths beyond immediate reach. Skill that worked everywhere else in the fishery could suddenly become irrelevant. Naming offered a way to contain that experience in language. Human beings have done something similar around dangerous waters for centuries, turning unfamiliar animals and forces into personalities that can be remembered, described, and passed between generations. Norse traditions filled distant seas with immense creatures. The Hebrew Bible gave Leviathan a form vast enough to embody powers beyond ordinary human command. Later, European traditions transformed uncertain sightings and sailors' reports into the Kraken, an imagined inhabitant of depths that few people could directly examine. Boca Grande produced its own version, without needing mythology in the formal sense. The shark was a known species, and the fishermen understood that hammerheads lived there. What exceeded ordinary experience was the reported individual, its scale, persistence, and repeated ability to take fish without being captured itself. The nickname converted those encounters into a shared identity. A captain could mention old Hitler, and others immediately understood that he meant more than merely another shark. Yet the comparison has a limit that matters. Human evil involves intention, responsibility, and choices made within human society. A predator possesses none of that moral burden. The hammerhead was behaving exactly as evolution had equipped it to behave, exploiting concentrated prey in a channel where seasonal abundance rewarded experience. The menace existed largely from the viewpoint of fishermen, whose purposes collided with its own feeding behavior. Seen across decades, the name becomes an artifact of that collision. It preserves a period when people possessed powerful boats, heavy tackle, engines, charts, and generations of local knowledge, yet still encountered an animal that remained beyond their control. They could pursue it, wound it, describe it, and give it the darkest name their era supplied. None of those acts made the shark subject to them. The name transformed frustration into character, and character into legend, allowing separate encounters across different seasons to become chapters in one remembered presence. That may be why the nickname endured after the original fishermen were gone. Beneath its historical ugliness was a recognition older than Boca Grande itself. The sea permits human presence without promising human authority. Sometimes the creature that exposes that boundary receives a name, and the name survives because the boundary does. There is a peculiar kind of inheritance that cannot be placed in a house, written into a will, or mounted above a fireplace. At Boca Grande, it passed from one generation of fishermen to the next as an unfinished act. The oldest captains pursued a shark they never landed. Their sons inherited the stories and returned to the same water. Now, their grandchildren arrive with stronger tackle, electronic charts, modern engines, and decades of biological research behind them, while great hammerhead encounters begin appearing more often again. What survived was not a trophy, it was the pursuit itself. Season after season, anglers entered Boca Grande Pass knowing that skill could carry them only so far. Most fishing rewards control. Knots are tested, drag is adjusted, tides are studied, bait is chosen, and experience gradually converts uncertainty into advantage. Yet the legend endured because one presence resisted that conversion. Somewhere within the ordinary work of catching tarpon remained the possibility that another animal could enter the encounter and overturn every calculation. Psychologists studying human contact with wilderness have found that natural environments can reduce stress, restore directed attention, and interrupt the mental fatigue produced by settings that constantly demand deliberate control. Part of that effect appears to come from encountering systems that do not organize themselves around human purposes. Weather moves without permission. Tides follow gravity. Predators pursue prey according to needs older than language. Attention shifts because the mind is no longer dealing entirely with things designed, scheduled, owned, or managed by people. For generations of Boca Grande captains, the great Hammerhead embodied that condition in unusually tangible form. It was not an imagined monster placed beyond the edge of a map. It was an animal that could appear beside the boat, take a hooked tarpon, refuse the terms of the contest, and depart. Its reality mattered. So did the fact that knowledge did not guarantee mastery. That distinction changes the meaning of all those unsuccessful attempts. Failure normally implies that a goal remained incomplete. Here, incompletion became part of the tradition. Each broken line preserved the possibility that the pass contained something beyond the practical limits of the person holding the rod. Returning meant entering that uncertainty again, carrying improved equipment while accepting that improvement might still prove insufficient. The fishermen may never have described their relationship in those terms. They did not need to. Their behavior recorded it. Careers accumulated around annual migrations, familiar channels, remembered encounters, and stories repeated until the men inside them were gone. The shark remained uncaught, yet the absence of a final capture gave the pursuit continuity. A landed specimen could have been weighed, photographed, measured, and eventually reduced to a record. An animal that escaped remained larger in another sense, unfinished, and therefore capable of accompanying another generation onto the water. Modern science complicates that inheritance. The great hammerhead is now critically endangered. Its surviving populations carry reduced genetic diversity, and the immense old individuals once removed from the ocean cannot simply be replaced by better management within a few seasons. The thing earlier fishermen experienced as inexhaustible wilderness was never inexhaustible at all. Human technology could fail against one enormous shark while succeeding, collectively, at diminishing the species across oceans. That creates a different meaning for the desire to have something beyond human control. Such a creature cannot remain beyond capture unless people first choose to leave enough of its world intact. Sovereignty in nature is no longer merely something encountered. In an age capable of emptying seas, it can depend upon restraint. Perhaps that is the deeper inheritance at Boca Grande. The pursuit mattered because it never ended in possession. Its value survived precisely where ownership failed, in the recurring recognition that another life could share the same water without becoming ours. A conservation category can look strangely small beside the life it describes. Critically endangered is a phrase printed in reports, attached to assessments, and entered into databases. Population decline becomes a percentage. Genetic contraction becomes a pattern in sampled genomes. Longevity becomes the age of an individual female. Each measurement is useful, yet none can contain the full meaning of an ocean losing animals that once seemed beyond the reach of ordinary human power. What disappears with the great hammerhead is partly ecological, but the loss also changes the human experience of the sea. For most of our history, oceans exceeded us in nearly every practical sense. Their depths concealed entire landscapes. Storms erased routes. Predators removed catches before anyone understood what had happened. People could build stronger vessels and sharper hooks, but beyond the shoreline remained a domain whose inhabitants followed neither human boundaries nor human intentions. Modern technology has narrowed that distance. Satellites follow migrations across ocean basins. Electronic instruments reveal contours beneath boats. Genetic analysis can reconstruct ancestry from tissue. Industrial fleets can locate, capture, process, and transport marine animals on a scale earlier fishermen could scarcely have conceived. Knowledge has expanded beautifully, but extraction expanded beside it. An animal need not be individually conquerable for its population to be collectively diminished. That distinction lies at the heart of the old Boca Grande legend. The great shark described there represented physical resistance at the scale of one encounter. Lines failed, gear yielded. A wounded animal survived and returned. Yet while fishermen remembered an individual that seemed impossible to defeat, distant fisheries were demonstrating another form of power. No single vessel needed to conquer the greatest hammerhead in the Gulf. Enough vessels, removing enough sharks across enough years, could make such individuals increasingly unlikely to exist. The result is visible in more than abundance. Reduced genetic diversity narrows the range of biological possibilities carried forward. The loss of old females removes reproductive histories that took decades to build. Fewer exceptionally large adults alter predator relationships that developed around their presence. A population can remain alive while becoming less capable of producing the extremes that once defined its mature form. Other great marine animals carry similar histories. Bluefin tuna, sperm whales, tiger sharks, and many large predators have encountered industries capable of reaching them across migration routes that once functioned as refuges through sheer distance. Their reduction changes food webs, but it also changes expectation. A coastline inhabited mostly by animals that fit comfortably within our equipment teaches a different lesson from one where something immense may arrive beyond our ability to control it. Management itself is not the enemy of wonder. Counting animals, protecting habitat, limiting harvest, and tracking movement can preserve what exploitation would otherwise erase. The deeper paradox is that administration has become necessary because human reach has grown so extensive. Protection now helps maintain the very wildness that earlier generations encountered without needing to protect it from themselves. Old Hitler survives in memory because the animal was never fully converted into possession. No definitive specimen settled the measurements. No trophy ended the argument. What remained was a scarred shape moving beneath generations of testimony, rooted in the biology of a real species capable of extraordinary size, endurance, navigation, and independence. Now, that species carries the highest level of extinction risk before disappearance in the wild. The ocean's old refusal has not been defeated by one victorious fisherman. It has been reduced gradually, statistically, across decades and borders. What remains asks for a different relationship with power, one in which the greatest achievement may be leaving enough beyond our control for the sea to remain a world larger than ourselves. To inhabit the body of a great hammerhead is to occupy a sensory world for which human experience offers only imperfect comparisons. Water does not merely surround the animal. It carries pressure, vibration, dissolved chemicals, temperature gradients, current, light, and faint electrical fields, each arriving through a different biological channel. Boca Grande Pass, descending roughly 75 feet, would not present itself as an empty depth beneath a surface. It would be a layered field of usable information. Across the broad cephalofoil, widely spaced eyes provide an expanded visual field, while sensory pores sample minute electrical disturbances at close range. Along the body, The lateral line responds to movement and low-frequency vibration in surrounding water. Chemical cues reach the nostrils. Changes in pressure and current register through systems shaped by millions of years of evolution in an environment where information travels through flesh and water differently than it does through air. For an old shark, those systems operated through a body marked by experience. A damaged dorsal fin, healed wounds, embedded stingray barbs, or scars left by encounters with fishing gear were not symbols. They were altered tissue, changes to the physical animal itself. A machete strike, a harpoon wound, or contact with a propeller would have produced acute injury and physiological stress, followed, if survived, by healing. The nervous system could also learn from harmful encounters, changing later behavior without requiring anything resembling a human story about the past. That distinction matters. Sharks possess learning, memory, and behavioral flexibility, but their subjective experience cannot be reconstructed directly. Calling their responses fear in the full human sense risks importing emotions whose internal forms science cannot measure. What can be observed is avoidance, heightened activity, escape behavior, conditioning, and the ability to associate places or stimuli with consequences. An animal surviving for decades could therefore accumulate useful information about recurring situations even without remembering them as narrated episodes. Its return to Boca Grande during tarpon season would have emerged from several overlapping signals rather than one irresistible beacon. Great hammerheads can orient across large distances, while currents, temperature, seasonal cycles, magnetic information, chemical traces, and learned sight fidelity can help guide movement toward productive habitat. Once near concentrations of prey, the sensory architecture of the head becomes especially valuable. Electroreception is most effective at close range, where tiny fields generated by living muscles and nerves can help reveal prey that vision alone might miss. A mass of tarpon would announce itself through many channels. Schooling fish disturb water on a large scale. Their movement creates vibration and pressure changes. Their bodies leave chemical information behind. At hunting distance, individual animals become targets that can be tracked, approached, and intercepted. The hammerhead does not need to understand a migration as an event. Seasonal abundance is translated into immediate sensory opportunity. Even the scars that fascinated fishermen belong to this other reality. Humans saw identity in them. A notch became evidence that the same giant had returned. A wound became part of a legend carried through bait shops and generations. For the shark, the mark had no reputation attached to it. It was simply healed anatomy traveling with the animal. That may be the widest distance between old Hitler and the people who named it. Every human encounter accumulated language around the shark. Measurements, arguments, memories, warnings, exaggerations, and eventually science. The animal accumulated none of those meanings. It moved through gradients, currents, prey fields, injury, recovery, hunger, migration, and age. Humans turned those movements into a century-long character. The hammerhead remained an organism responding to a world available through senses unlike our own. We gave it the name of something terrible because naming made the encounter intelligible. It had no equivalent category for the boats above it, no legend for the fishermen, and no name for us at all. Long before Florida had its present outline, warm seas occupied this region, advancing and retreating as climates shifted and continents continued their slow rearrangement. The Gulf of Mexico began opening far deeper in geological time, while the coast familiar today emerged from changes in sea level, sediment, reef growth, and erosion. Against that background, the lives moving through Boca Grande Pass belong to histories far older than the names humans placed upon them. Hammerhead sharks arose tens of millions of years ago, and the great hammerhead belongs to a lineage refined within oceans already populated by fast fishes, rays, turtles, and other sharks. Its broad head, tall dorsal fin, sensory architecture, and sweeping movement are inherited solutions preserved because they continued to work. Generations vanished, environments shifted, shorelines migrated. Yet the relationship between predator, prey, current, and seasonal abundance endured. Tarpon carry an even deeper ancestry. Their broader evolutionary branch reaches back more than 100 million years, through seas inhabited by marine reptiles and ammonites, across the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction that ended the age of no-Navian dinosaurs, and onward into the modern ocean. Their descendants still gather along Florida in immense seasonal movements, silver bodies following conditions that concentrate food, suitable temperature, and opportunities for reproduction. Each spring, Boca Grande becomes one point where these ancient histories intersect. The pass is about 75 feet deep, yet its importance comes from structure rather than scale. Strong tidal flow compresses movement through a narrow opening. Tarpon accumulate there in extraordinary numbers. Predators respond to that concentration. Nothing in the encounter requires a legend. The pattern is ecological, an old exchange of energy between animals whose evolutionary histories began before anything resembling a human fishing boat existed. Seen across that timescale, the enormous shark remembered as Old Hitler becomes less like a biological exception. Exceptional size within an individual does not necessarily mean exceptional design. Healthy populations contain variation, and large populations provide more opportunities for rare combinations of longevity, growth, favorable habitat, and genetics to appear. At the far edge of such variation, unusually large animals can emerge without violating the biology of their species. That distinction changes the meaning of the old accounts. A giant hammerhead was remarkable to the people who encountered it, but waters supporting abundant, mature sharks could once make extreme individuals less improbable. The extraordinary feature may not have been that one animal became so large. It may have been that the surrounding ecosystem retained enough biological depth for such an animal to exist at all. Modern depletion reverses that arithmetic. When populations contract, fewer individuals survive long enough to approach their maximum potential size. Fishing mortality removes large adults disproportionately in many shark populations, while reduced genetic diversity can narrow the biological reservoir from which future generations are assembled. For a slow-growing predator with limited reproductive output, losses accumulate across decades rather than disappearing with the next breeding season. A coastline can look familiar while the biological possibilities beneath its surface have changed. Water still passes through the same channel, tarpon still arrive, hammerheads still follow them. Yet resemblance in scenery does not guarantee continuity in abundance, age structure, genetic diversity, or the probability of producing an animal near the outer boundary of what the species can become. In that sense, the ocean remembers without possessing memory. Its history persists in genes, migrations, inherited anatomy, food webs, sediments, and recurring movements shaped across geological time. What once lived here leaves traces in living descendants and in the conditions they require. Old Hitler belongs among those traces, not as proof of a vanished monster, but as evidence of a gulf capable of producing more biological abundance than the present generation has inherited. Whether such waters can produce another giant depends not on legend, but on what remains alive enough to be passed forward. There is no specimen in a museum drawer bearing the name Old Hitler. No verified length was taken from the animal the captains believed they recognized. No weight settled the arguments at the dock, and no final photograph closed the distance between observation and legend. What remains is a convergence of testimony, ecology, anatomy, tracking data, and population history. For the fishermen, the unresolved ending was part of the animal's power. A hammerhead could appear beneath a hooked tarpon, remove living prey from the line, and descend beyond reach before anyone aboard had converted the encounter into action. The absence of capture preserved uncertainty. Scars became identifiers. Separate sightings could belong to one long-lived shark, several exceptional sharks, or some mixture gradually compressed by memory into a single enduring figure. Science does not need to destroy that ambiguity. It narrows what is biologically plausible while revealing that the underlying story requires no supernatural explanation. Great hammerheads grow to extraordinary dimensions, undertake long migrations, return repeatedly to productive habitats, detect electrical fields produced by living animals, and respond to environmental information unavailable to human senses. An individual surviving for decades could accumulate injuries, learned responses, repeated routes, and feeding experience without understanding any human story attached to its movements. The greater uncertainty now lies elsewhere. Great hammerheads are listed as critically endangered by the International Union for Conservation of Nature after severe declines globally. Large adults are consequential because this species grows slowly, matures late, and produces relatively few young. Removing mature animals does more than reduce a head count. It shortens age structure, erases reproductive opportunities, and reduces the number of individuals capable of reaching the extreme sizes remembered from earlier generations. Genetic evidence adds another dimension. When populations become small and fragmented, genetic diversity can decline, while mating among relatives becomes more likely. The consequences unfold across generations, not as a visible collapse in a single season. Traits are reshuffled through fewer lineages. Rare genetic combinations become harder to preserve. Recovery, therefore, means more than seeing hammerheads return beneath fishing boats. It requires enough breeding animals, connectivity, and time for a population to regain resilience. None of this enters the shark's experience as conservation status or population genetics. A great hammerhead encounters current, temperature, odor, pressure, electrical activity, and magnetic information. Its nervous system receives a world assembled from signals different from ours. A struggling fish is muscle activity translated into detectable electrical fields. A migration route is shaped by inherited behavior, environmental cues, experience, and sensory capacities under study. Boca Grande Pass is not a legend to the animal, it is habitat. That difference leaves the human story resting on an unusual boundary. Above the surface are names, measurements, records, tournaments, memories, and arguments passed across generations. Beneath it is an animal without any knowledge of those categories, responding to older conditions. Old Hitler was never caught, and certainty never arrived afterward. Perhaps one exceptional shark generated many accounts. Perhaps several giants became one in memory. Either possibility leads back to the same biological reality. Gulf waters once supported great hammerheads, large and old enough to make such stories credible. The final measure of the legend is therefore not whether the old shark can still be found. It is whether the living ocean retains enough abundance, age, genetic breadth, and space to produce animals that can remain beyond easy human control. Somewhere beneath the moving gulf, hammerheads still follow currents and prey through the old passages. They carry no human name. Their continuation depends on whether enough of their ancient biological inheritance survives to keep moving with them. The most consequential conservation decision at Boca Grande Pass may be the one nobody remembers making. There was no morning when captains gathered at the docks and agreed that the largest hammerheads should disappear. No single season carried a clear boundary between abundance and depletion. Each removal belonged to its own moment. One fish, one photograph, one tournament entry, one story brought home. Only across decades did those separate acts become a population trend. Great hammerheads were especially vulnerable to that accumulation. Their biology offers little room for rapid replacement. They grow slowly, mature late, and invest in relatively small numbers of young compared with many fishes. Removing a large adult, therefore, subtracts more than a body from the sea. It can remove years of future reproduction, along with genetic combinations carried by an animal that survived long enough to reach exceptional size. When fishing pressure repeatedly favors the largest individuals, the loss is concentrated precisely where recovery is slowest. By the time formal protections strengthened, much of that biological capital had already vanished. International trade in great hammerheads came under Appendix 2 of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora in 2014. In 2018, the International Union for Conservation of Nature assessed the species as critically endangered. A petition seeking protection under the United States Endangered Species Act followed in 2022. Long before those milestones, research associated with Mote Marine Laboratory had already described severe depletion in the Gulf of Mexico, with estimates reaching roughly 75 to 90%. This sequence is familiar in conservation biology. Management often becomes strongest after abundance has ceased to feel normal. Regulations tighten once catches decline, surveys reveal scarcity, and genetic evidence begins recording consequences that cannot be reversed simply by stopping harvest. A reduced population may grow again, yet lost genetic diversity does not automatically return with additional animals. Inbreeding can persist because descendants are rebuilding from a narrower inheritance than the population once possessed. The restraint that might have mattered most would have looked unnecessary when it was needed. It would have meant protecting mature hammerheads while they were still encountered often enough to seem inexhaustible. It would have required leaving extraordinary animals alive precisely because they were extraordinary, allowing their reproductive years to continue rather than treating maximum size as proof of maximum trophy value. That expectation asks something difficult of people living inside an older understanding of the sea. Gulf Coast fishermen inherited a culture in which abundance appeared self-renewing, and the largest catch represented skill, endurance, livelihood, or prestige. The ecological consequences were distributed across so many boats, years, fisheries, and coastlines that no individual pursuit could reveal the full trajectory. A captain returning with a giant hammerhead saw one animal removed from immense water. Population biology, decades later, saw the cumulative subtraction. The surviving great hammerheads now inhabit the cost of that delay. Their protection is stronger because their scarcity is measurable. Their value as living predators is better understood because scientists have documented migration, reproduction, site fidelity, and genetic vulnerability. Yet conservation undertaken after collapse must accomplish more with less. Chosen restraint begins from another premise. It leaves room before evidence of disaster becomes overwhelming. It accepts that abundance can itself deserve protection, and that the largest animal in the water may be worth more alive, reproducing and carrying its lineage through another season, than as proof that human hands were capable of taking it. In that form, restraint is older than regulation. It is the deliberate decision to encounter power without converting every encounter into possession. Long before conservation acquired legal language, coastal societies had already discovered a practical truth about abundance. A fishery could appear endless to one generation and still depend on limits honored by the people using it. Those limits were not always written as statutes or calculated through population models. In many places, they lived in custom, seasonal closure, restricted grounds, selective harvest, ceremony, and obligations carried between families. Across parts of the Pacific, indigenous communities developed marine tenure systems that treated access to reefs, lagoons, and fishing grounds as something governed rather than open to unlimited extraction. Practices differed greatly between islands and cultures, yet many shared an understanding that productive water required reciprocal behavior. Certain places could be closed. Particular species could be left during vulnerable seasons. Harvest might be shaped by social rules that preserved breeding animals or allowed depleted areas to recover. The language was different from modern conservation biology, but the underlying observation was recognizable. Taking everything available eventually changes what remains available. Boca Grande inherited another tradition. Its fishermen also possessed intimate ecological knowledge gathered through years of tides, seasons, migrations, and repeated encounters. They knew where tarpon gathered, where predators approached, how current changed around submerged structure, and when an unusual animal had returned. Old Hitler became part of that accumulated knowledge because the shark was not merely described as large. Accounts gave it continuity through scars, a damaged fin, behavior, location, and repeated appearance. Naming transformed an unidentified predator into a known presence. Men who could not measure the animal could still recognize features they believed belonged to it. Stories passed those details between boats and generations, creating a form of local natural history outside laboratories and scientific journals. In that sense, the legend preserved observation. It recorded the conviction that one exceptional hammerhead, or perhaps a small number eventually merged into one identity, repeatedly occupied the same human landscape. Yet recognition did not become restraint. Familiarity made the animal more desirable to catch. Every escape preserved both the shark and the ambition surrounding it. Stronger tackle promised another attempt. Larger hooks, heavier lines, different methods, and experienced captains kept alive the belief that technical improvement would eventually convert knowledge into possession. That distinction separates knowing an animal from accepting an obligation toward it. A community can understand migration, feeding behavior, seasonal timing, and individual markings while still viewing abundance primarily through opportunity. Ecological knowledge alone does not determine how people act. The values surrounding that knowledge decide whether an exceptional animal becomes protected, harvested, ignored, or pursued precisely because it has survived everything before. For decades, Boca Grande received the same practical result without deliberately choosing it. The legendary shark remained uncaught. Human effort repeatedly reached a boundary imposed by depth, current, anatomy, behavior, equipment, and chance. Each failure could be interpreted as unfinished business, another invitation to return with something stronger. An older ethic might have interpreted survival differently. Persistence itself could have become sufficient reason to leave the animal where it belonged, not because it was harmless, sacred, or scientifically important, but because continued existence had value within the relationship. That is the deeper contract conservation law can imitate, but never fully create. Regulation can establish seasons, prohibit harvest, control trade, and protect threatened species. It cannot supply reciprocity by itself. That begins when abundance is met with limits before scarcity demands them. Old Hitler survived the pursuit without receiving that gift from the people who named it. The restraint came from the animal, from the pass, and from repeated human failure. What remained unlearned was the possibility that some encounters do not need to end in capture to become complete. At Boca Grande, permanence belongs less to the creatures than to the movement carrying them. Water enters the pass, accelerates across submerged contours, folds around the ledges, and continues toward the Gulf. Boats arrive and leave above it. Generations of captains disappear from the docks. Beneath them, the physical corridor remains, still gathering migrating animals into a narrow meeting place shaped by depth, tide, temperature, and season. The earliest Old Hitler accounts reach back to 1911, when the pass was already known for encounters that seemed too large for ordinary fishing stories. More than a century later, its deepest channels still descend toward 75 feet. Tarpons still assemble there during spring migration, following patterns inherited from a lineage roughly 100 million years old. Their arrival does not depend upon the legend attached to this place. April brings them because their biology responds to conditions older than any name written on a chart. Great hammerheads continue to enter that same seasonal concentration. Modern tracking has made portions of their movement visible in ways earlier fishermen could never have imagined, yet visibility has not made the animals simple. Their migrations arise from overlapping cues, including temperature, prey distribution, magnetic information, and sensory signals carried through seawater. A hammerhead returning to familiar coastal habitat is following an internal map assembled by evolution and individual experience, a map science can observe without fully reading. What has become harder to find is the biological excess that once gave Boca Grande its most extravagant stories. Today's population carries the imprint of depletion. Fewer breeding animals mean fewer combinations of inherited variation and fewer opportunities for exceptionally old individuals to occupy the far edge of the species' natural range. A surviving giant would therefore represent more than unusual growth. It would contain decades of feeding, migration, injury, recovery, and reproductive history preserved within one living body. That possibility keeps Old Hitler suspended between biology and folklore. Cartilage in shark vertebrae can preserve growth information that researchers use when estimating age, but no instrument can sample an animal that has never been captured or identified with certainty. A notched dorsal fin, glimpsed decades apart, cannot establish identity across generations. The evidence reaches a boundary there. Beyond it, certainty gives way to the same incomplete view that created the legend. Yet, the absence of an answer does not empty the pass. Its meaning was never contained entirely in one shark. The deeper continuity lies in a functioning place, where ancient migrations still overlap, where predator and prey still find one another through signals human senses barely register, and where the water continues to organize life according to conditions no fisherman invented. The name Old Hitler belongs to human memory. The hammerhead has no use for it. Scars, roots, hunger, reproductive cycles, and sensory information are enough. If an enormous animal still moves beneath those boats, its existence does not depend upon recognition. If the original shark disappeared long ago, the ecological pattern that produced the encounters remains diminished but not erased. Each spring, tarpon enter Boca Grande Pass again. Hammerheads still follow them. Current presses through the ledges, carrying chemical traces, vibration, warmth, and electrical information through 75 feet of Gulf water. Above, people watch for a fin that might connect the present to an inherited story. Below, life continues without needing that connection. What remains is not proof that the legend survived. It is something more tangible, the living machinery that once made such a legend possible, still turning beneath the surface, carrying whatever remains on its own terms.